Welcome to Curators Corner. I'm Jessica Chase, curator of 4 of the 5 county museums here in Prince Edward County. And we mentioned in our last installment that the dress and the letter showcased then were the catalysts for the So Went the Summer exhibit. But what happened next? When we realized that we had this incredible story to tell, or we thought we had an incredible story to tell, of a woman, Mary Northway, and we presumed her partner, Flora Morrison. Where do we go from here? So we recognized that there were over 50 items that had been donated by these 2 women to our collection, and we started to locate those items and bring them together and think about them in a larger context. And they had all come from a prominent county home. But in terms of these women's personal lives, their professional lives, these objects couldn't really tell us much about that. So luckily for us, we discovered that these 2 women who lived throughout the majority of the 20th century had left their personal files, their correspondence, papers related to their family histories, respective family histories. Mary Northway, who was born and raised in Toronto, and Flora, who was born in Scotland, but then soon as a young girl found herself adopted into a county family. They had both left their papers to the Trent University Archives. So myself and Liz, the collections manager here, we traveled to the archives multiple times in an effort to really dive in to these archival records and get a better sense of who these 2 women were and what their lives together were really like. And by looking at these papers, we were also able to flesh out the stories of the people who had used the artifacts that we'd been donated. All of the furnishings that we had in Macaulay House and elsewhere, all of a sudden, instead of just being furniture, they were associated with people and they had stories to tell.
So in this case, we have a selection of the artifacts that were donated by the estate of Flora Morrison. So she died in 1981, and her partner Mary spent the next 6 years doing projects in her memory. And one of those projects was to make sure that all the artifacts that they had kept in their home that had come from this historic county house ended up back in the county museum. So one of the fascinating parts of this story is that all of this accumulated material, the earliest piece is this ladle with a Loyalist coin in it that goes back to 1757 and the reign of George II, so prior to the American Revolution. So we know that these are examples of Loyalist artifacts. They came to the county and were associated with Loyalist families, in particular the family of Asa Weller. So Asa was one of the first grantees of the large tract of land in the Carrying Place area, and his daughter, Sarah Weller, is credited with being one of the first European-descended children to be born in the county, and she lived her whole life here and is buried in the Carrying Place Cemetery. And we have this letter written to her talking about her house being built. So it was the 3rd of the 3 Weller houses built on the old Portage Road. And we are also lucky enough to have not just the letter written by her husband, Richard Miskin, but also Richard Miskin's exercise book, which is on loan to us from the Trent University Archives, where we can see that he was a very educated man and well-studied and had beautiful penmanship. And these are just some of the artifacts that accumulated in this house that was in the family from 1829 until 1964. And in that time, there was almost always at least 2 or 3 generations living in the house, which allowed this accumulation of history to happen. So not only do we have artifacts that date to before the house was built in the 1700s, but we also have artifacts that go right up until when the house was converted to electricity, and they took some of their old oil lamps and had them electrified. This section here is from roughly the 1870s, when a German-speaking American immigrant, married into the family. And we have a family tree to help make it a little clearer for everyone because there are so many people's stories wrapped up in this exhibit.
So Flora Morrison was born, yes, in Scotland, and her father, George, was an electrical engineer, and he had married Martha Corrigan of Carrying Place, of course. So this brings Flora into the county story and into the family of the Wellers, the Miskins, the Corrigans, into that line. And Flora, because of her father's profession, she actually lived quite a privileged upbringing. Her parents were well-to-do enough to send her to summer camp. And at that time, in the late 1920s, early 1930s, when you could afford to go to a private girls' summer camp, that was a real sense of independence. It gave you a real sense of independence. Because unlike summer camps for girls that were much more affordable, that often focused strictly on the domestic arts and priming girls for lives as women and mothers, private girls' summer camps were almost identical to boys. They still had focus on the domestic arts, but they also learned how to live outdoors and go canoe tripping. And it was really, really different and special for women or girls like Flora to be able to experience that. And so one year at summer camp, Flora met Mary, who was a few years her senior. And from that year in 1930, they would spend the rest of their lives together, which we learned through going through those archival records at Trent University. So they went on to become professional women. They were both educators. One was a kindergarten teacher. Mary actually pursued her PhD. She got her PhD in sociology and was a professor for 30 years at the University of Toronto. So they were incredibly intelligent and often studious women, but they really never lost their love of outdoor education and of just spending time generally in the outdoors. The two of them, they purchased a property together in Haliburton and ran a canoe tripping camp for young women in the 1940s. And then later they would spend a considerable amount of time at their property with other women of their acquaintance, professional women that they knew from Toronto, and they would invite them to this property in order to just talk about the issues facing Canada and the world and really solve the world's problems, in addition to just being able to bond with one another. So we learned so much that it really enriched their stories from that initial letter of Mary's that Liz read so many years ago. But I think in our next installment, we're going to go into a bit more depth about why this exhibit has the title that it does, So Went the Summer.